Ragnar's shout echoed through the forest as he raised the ritual axe above the Saxon slave's head. "By the gods, stop!" little Freydis screamed, throwing herself between the blade and the kneeling man. "He saved my life. The gods sent him." The clan fell silent. The sacrificial blood had to be spilled before the solstice, and the Jarl's word was final. But the determined gaze of the 6-year-old girl made the executioner's axe tremble in his hands. Thank you for joining us today. This channel is just beginning its journey, and every subscriber means the world to us. If you enjoy these stories of Viking life, honor, and sacrifice, please consider subscribing to help us reach our first 1,000 followers. Your support keeps this project alive and growing. And don't forget to leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. We'd love to know where our story is reaching. The forest lay thick and silent, a cloak of frost shimmering over every branch and blade of grass beneath the pale morning sun. A frigid wind whispered through the towering pines, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine resin, mingled with the faint smoke of distant hearth fires. The sky above was a soft gray, heavy with clouds that threatened snow, yet the sun's weak light spilled through the gaps, casting long, cold shadows across the frozen ground. It was a morning that held a quiet promise of hardship, one that only those living at the edge of the world could understand. Wulfric moved through the camp like a shadow, his steps light and careful across the frozen dirt path. At 28 winters, his body bore the marks of hardship more than age. Lean and gaunt, muscles tense beneath his coarse linen tunic, his dark brown hair tangled and unkempt. His skin, pale and weathered by the cruel northern wind, was scarred with thin, pale lines where the whip had bitten deep during punishments. His eyes, a deep shade of brown, flickered constantly with wariness, the kind that comes from years spent caught between survival and despair. Each morning began the same, swallowed by routine and quiet servitude. As a Saxon slave, Wulfric's place was far from the warmth of the great hall where the Jarl and his kin feasted. Instead, he labored in the shadows, hewing firewood, tending the animals, mending tools, his hands rough and cracked from ceaseless toil. Today was no different, yet a restless tension stirred beneath his measured movements. The weight of recent days pressed on his mind like a stone in his chest. He paused momentarily beside a low wooden fence enclosing a small herd of goats, their woolly flanks coated in frost. The animals huddled close, their breath steaming in the cold air, eyes wary as he approached. Wulfric reached down, breaking off a brittle branch from a nearby alder tree and stripped the twigs to offer fresh feed. The goats nibbled cautiously, their soft bleats the only sound besides the distant clatter of hammer against anvil and the murmur of voices. Around him, the camp stirred to life. Viking women bustled about, weaving baskets, grinding grain, and preparing thin, smoky slices of dried fish over open fires. The sharp, earthy smell of peat smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of boiling herbs. Children darted between tents and cabins, their laughter bright against the somber backdrop of winter's grip. The warriors sharpened their blades and spears near the forge, their faces grim in the cold light, the metal singing faintly as it was worked. Wulfric pulled his worn cloak tighter across his shoulders, the coarse fabric doing little to ward off the chill. His breath rose in quick, misted bursts as he moved toward the woodpile where he was expected to gather kindling. The rough bark bit at his palms, and he winced as old scars caught on splinters. Each small injury was a reminder of his place here, always just beneath notice, never quite a man. Yet, in those fleeting moments alone, his thoughts drifted far beyond Ravnholm. He remembered the green rolling hills and misty forests of Northumbria, the faint warmth of his mother's hands, the sound of church bells ringing faintly in the distance. Those memories were fragile and distant, yet they burned inside him like a flicker of fire in the cold. They were a whisper of hope when everything else was silence. Wulfric's daily life existed within a harsh cycle of servitude and fear. The Vikings who ruled this land showed little mercy to their prisoners. He had learned early to keep his head low, speak only when spoken to, and never draw attention. Yet the stories whispered among the slaves told of a fate worse than chains, death in the rituals of the gods. Sacrifices to Odin, Thor, and Freya were not mere superstition but a terrifying certainty when misfortune fell upon the clan. That morning, the air buzzed with unease. The drought had lasted longer than any living soul could remember. Fields lay cracked and barren. The rivers that once teemed with fish were little more than trickles. The people's prayers had grown desperate, their offerings more frequent and grave. The Jarl's announcement of the upcoming blot, the sacred sacrifice, had sent ripples of tension through the camp. No one spoke openly about who might be chosen, but the fear was palpable, woven into every glance and whispered conversation. Wulfric, though a slave and outsider, felt the weight of it as deeply as any man born to the soil. He understood the gravity of failing the gods, how it meant not just hunger, but death and damnation for all. Yet, he was also painfully aware that his own life was viewed with cold calculation. A Saxon slave could be discarded like driftwood when no longer useful. As he gathered small branches and dry twigs, his gaze flicked toward the edge of the forest where a group of children played under the watchful eyes of women. Among them was the Jarl's daughter, Freydis. Her pale hair glistened like spun silver in the dim light. She was small and fragile, yet there was an undeniable strength in the sharp set of her chin, the determined glimmer in her ice-blue eyes. Wulfric had seen her often, a beacon of innocence amid the harshness of the camp. Their worlds rarely intersected, separated not only by birth and status, but by the invisible lines of fear and tradition. Yet, there was something about Freydis that stirred a quiet compassion in him. Perhaps it was the way she moved, bold even in play, or the unguarded moments when she smiled at the others, her laughter a fragile thread against the cold silence. The distant clang of metal rang out sharply, pulling Wulfric from his thoughts. Halfdan, the clan's healer, was already at work tending to the wounds of warriors returning from routine patrols. The scent of healing herbs hung thick in the air, mingling with the stinging cold and smoke. Wulfric's own shoulder throbbed faintly, a dull reminder of punishment long past. He flexed his fingers, feeling the rough skin catch on the coarse fibers of his tunic. The camp was a world unto itself, a small village carved into the wild lands, surrounded by dense forests and jagged hills. The great hall dominated the center, its massive timber walls adorned with intricate carvings of serpents and wolves, symbols of protection and power. Smoke curled upward from its chimneys, carrying the mingled voices of feasting and celebration, a sharp contrast to the silent tension threading through the rest of the settlement. As the morning wore on, the sky darkened with shifting clouds. The promise of snow hung in the air like an unspoken warning. Wulfric's hands were raw and bloody from gathering wood, his breath ragged in the thin air. Yet, beneath the fatigue, a restless urgency grew. The whispers of the elders, the furtive glances cast toward him, the knowledge that fate was closing in. He had heard the rumors, whispers of the coming blot, of the sacrifices demanded by the gods to restore balance and favor. A sacrifice to Odin, to Thor, to Freya. Someone chosen to bear the blood debt, to spill their life so others might live. His name was never spoken aloud, but the unspoken fear was clear. The slave was a convenient offering, a life already diminished, easily discarded. Still, as he moved through the camp, Wulfric held onto a small ember of defiance. He was no longer the frightened boy dragged from his home, no longer just a broken captive. The years had forged in him a quiet strength, a will to endure, a hope that even in the darkest shadows, there might be light. His eyes fell once again on the edge of the forest, where Freydis played with other children, her laughter sharp against the... He hesitated, breath shallow, mind racing. The rational part of him urged retreat, a quick step back into the shadows where no one would expect him to act beyond his bounds. But the memory of his own childhood flickered faintly, of his mother's warm hands brushing dirt from his face, of her voice telling him that none should suffer alone. That memory was a fragile thread tying him to a humanity he fought to keep alive. Wulfric set down the wood slowly, glancing around to confirm no warrior or overseer was watching. The camp was still. Most had turned their attention to the growing preparations for the blot. The great hall's doors hung open, spilling flickering torchlight into the dusk, while the fields beyond lay barren and cracked under the pale sky. The weight of expectation pressed heavy on every soul here. None dared speak openly of the sacrifice to come, but all knew the price that might be paid. His gaze drifted toward the edge of the forest. There, a small figure crouched near a gnarled oak, trembling visibly. It was the Jarl's daughter, Freydis, the little girl with pale hair and eyes as cold and sharp as ice. She clutched a small knife of bone, her fingers white with tension, yet she was utterly alone. The sight tightened something inside Wulfric. He knew the dangers of the wild, the hunger that gnawed at the wolves, and the cruelty of the land's harsh winters. The girl was vulnerable in a way no child of the north should ever be. Yet here she was, isolated, exposed. His breath fogged in the cold air as he stepped closer, cautious. The dry twigs beneath his boots cracked softly, betraying his approach. Freydis turned abruptly, eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, the weight of her gaze pinned him, a stranger, a slave, an enemy in the eyes of this frozen world. But there was something else there, too, a flicker of recognition, perhaps of desperation. Freydis, he said quietly, unsure if she could understand. He tried the word again, softer this time, in the broken but careful Nordic he had learned. You should not be here alone. She swallowed hard, her small shoulders trembling. I was chasing a squirrel, she lied, voice barely audible. But it ran too far. Wulfric studied her, seeing the dirt smudges on her cheek, the way her fingers gripped the bone knife so tightly it was almost an extension of her own trembling hand. The forest around them seemed to close in, the shadows lengthening beneath the heavy branches. Before he could say more, a low growl slithered through the underbrush, cold and menacing. Wulfric's head snapped toward the sound, eyes narrowing. The undergrowth rustled, and there, a lean, gaunt wolf emerged, its ribs visible beneath patchy fur, eyes glinting with hunger. It moved with deliberate, stalking steps, fixated on the child. Freydis froze, lips parted in a silent scream. Her knife, thin and fragile, offered little protection. Wulfric felt the weight of the moment pressed down like a stone on his chest. To act meant risking everything. His life, his fragile hold on survival here. To stand back was unthinkable. For a long, breathless second, the wolf crept closer, muscles coiled like springs. Wulfric's mind flashed to the stories whispered in the darkness. Wolves as harbingers of death, spirits of the wild sent to test men's fates. He could hear the faint crackle of his own heartbeat, pounding loud in his ears. Freydis, he said urgently, stepping forward, voice steady despite the cold clutch of fear. Do not move. Stay close to the tree. The girl looked up at him, eyes wide and searching, trusting in a way that startled him. He raised a thick branch, crude and heavy, gripping it with both hands. The wolf's yellow eyes locked onto him, nostrils flaring, hackles raised. Run for me when I say. Wulfric whispered, voice low but firm. Not back to the camp. The air was thick with tension, the forest silent but for the sound of the wolf's slow, deliberate steps. Time seemed to stretch, each heartbeat a drumbeat of fate. Wulfric's muscles tensed, ready for whatever would come. Then, with a sudden motion, he banged the branch against the tree trunk. The wolf snarled, momentarily startled. Wulfric met its gaze unflinchingly. Now he barked. Freydis launched herself forward, running toward him in a frantic surge of limbs and fear. Wulfric caught her just as the wolf lunged, teeth snapping mere inches away from her exposed arm. He pushed her behind himself, shielding her body with his own. Pain exploded as the wolf's jaws clamped down on his shoulder. A sharp, burning stab that seared through muscle and bone. Wulfric gritted his teeth, stifling a cry, steadying himself against the crush of the animal's strength. His hands, slick with blood, scrambled for something, anything, to defend them. Fingers closing around a jagged stone lying in the dirt, he swung blindly, striking the wolf's side. The animal yelped, releasing his shoulder with a violent shudder. It staggered, wounded but still dangerous, its eyes burning with fury and pain. The wolf's momentum faltered, and at that moment, an arrow sliced through the air, striking the creature squarely in the neck. The wolf let out a strangled howl before collapsing, its body twitching in death. Astrid appeared through the trees, bow still drawn, a cold glare fixed on Wulfric. Her footsteps were silent but deliberate as she advanced. "What madness is this?" she demanded, voice sharp as the winter wind. Her green eyes took in the bloodied slave holding the Jarl's daughter, then flicked to Freydis, trembling but unharmed. Wulfric's breath came ragged, his wound bleeding freely. The wolf, it attacked. He managed, words breaking under the weight of exhaustion and pain. "I saved her." Freydis clung to him, voice trembling with conviction. "He saved me, Astrid. The wolf would have torn me apart." The warrior's suspicion did not fade. Her arrow remained nocked, aimed but unrelenting. "Release the child. Kneel," she ordered, voice cold and final. Wulfric's heart sank. He obeyed without hesitation, carefully setting Freydis down. His legs weakened beneath the weight of his injuries and the knowledge of what this moment meant. Kneeling before the clan was not submission. It was a silent acceptance of a fate far worse than pain. The camp's eyes were already turning toward them, whispers rising like dark smoke. The shadow of sacrifice stretched long over the frozen earth, and Wulfric felt the cruel certainty settling into his bones. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol, a token to be exchanged for the clan's hopes. And yet, even as the cold seeped into his limbs, a flicker of something unexpected stirred. The child's trust gave him a fragile thread of strength. In the cold wilderness of his captivity, a single act of courage had set a course that none could yet see. The weight of the gods pressed down on all of them, demanding blood, demanding answers. But in that moment, beneath the gray sky and among the silent trees, a different kind of fire had been lit, a spark of compassion that would challenge the very foundations of Ravnholm. Wulfric closed his eyes, bracing for what was to come, yet holding onto the fragile hope that life, however fleeting, might still find a way in a world ruled by steel and sacrifice. The firelight flickered gently across the rough-hewn walls of the small cabin, casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits. Outside, the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the forest, but inside there was a fragile warmth, both from the flames and from something more delicate, less easily named. Wulfric sat close to the hearth, the heat seeping into his chilled bones as he carefully tended the wound on his shoulder. The pain throbbed steadily, a dull ache beneath the skin that reminded him of every brutal lash he had endured in the past. Yet tonight, it was different. Tonight, there was a purpose beyond mere survival. Freydis sat on a wooden stool nearby, her small hands folded tightly in her lap, blue eyes wide and unblinking as she watched him work. Her pale hair caught the light in soft waves, framing a face that was still touched by childhood innocence. Yet there was a hardness in her gaze, a determination that seemed far beyond her 6 winters. She clutched her silver amulet tightly, the symbol of Freya resting cool against her fingers, as if drawing strength from the goddess herself. Wulfric's fingers were slow and deliberate as the room seemed to hold its breath as the two sat in quiet companionship, the flickering fire casting a golden glow over their faces. Outside, the wind rattled the cabin's wooden walls, but inside, time slowed to a gentle rhythm. Wulfric tore a piece of coarse bread and handed it to Freydis, who accepted it with a shy nod. She bit into it carefully, her eyes never leaving his. He ate little, knowing his wound demanded strength, and the cold had drained him of much energy. Through the small window, moonlight filtered in, illuminating the faint markings on the girl's wrist, the crescent-shaped birthmark that seemed to glow softly in the silver light. Wulfric's gaze lingered there, a silent acknowledgment of the fragile life he had saved. He thought of the endless winters he had endured, the endless nights spent in chains and darkness. Here, in this cabin, he found something unfamiliar, a sense of quiet refuge. The old wooden door creaked softly as it was nudged open. Freydis tensed, her blue eyes darting to the shadowed threshold. It was Astrid, the shield maiden, her sharp gaze sweeping the room as she assessed the scene. The bow slung across her back and the quiver of arrows at her hip marked her unmistakably, but tonight her expression was less cold, more guarded. "She is safe," Wulfric said before she could speak, voice steady despite the pain. "No wolves near." Astrid's eyes flicked to the bloodied cloth wrapped around his shoulder. "You are lucky to be alive," she remarked, lowering her bow slightly. "And luckier still that the Jarl has spared you, for now." Freydis rose, moving quickly to stand beside Astrid, clutching the amulet around her neck. "He saved me," the girl insisted, voice quivering with emotion. "I owe him my life." Astrid's gaze hardened. "The gods decide what is owed, child. Do not forget that." Wulfric felt the weight of those words settle heavily in the room. The memory of Thorbjorn's cold voice and darkened eyes echoed in his mind. Yet in this moment, with the child before him, something stirred, a fragile hope that perhaps mercy could find a place among the gods' demands. In the silence that followed, Freydis stepped forward, reaching into her pocket to pull out a small wooden carving. It was rudimentary, a rough figure with delicate curves, but unmistakably shaped like Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. She handed it to Wulfric with a solemn expression. "For protection," she said simply. He took the gift, fingers tracing the worn edges. The gesture was small, but profound. In the harsh world of Ravenholm, this was a bond beyond words, a quiet pact forged in the flickering light of a dying fire. Wulfric's eyes caught the cord at his own neck, where a small, hidden pendant hung beneath his coarse tunic. A simple cross carved from bone, a relic from the life he had lost but still carried within. He touched it lightly, feeling its cool surface as if drawing strength from the memory of a distant home. The night deepened, and the two sat side by side, the distance between captor and captive shrinking with each passing hour. Freydis's small hand found his, the warmth of balm against the harsh cold of captivity. She did not ask questions about his past. He did not offer explanations. In that silence, something unspoken grew, a fragile trust born of shared vulnerability. Outside, the forest whispered ancient secrets, the rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl weaving a quiet symphony of night. Wulfric closed his eyes briefly, listening to the rhythm of the world beyond the cabin walls. In this moment, he was neither slave nor prisoner, neither Saxon nor stranger. He was simply a man who had chosen to stand between a child and death. The first light of dawn crept softly through the wooden slats, touching the frost that clung stubbornly to the window pane. Freydis stirred, blinking away sleep as she looked up at Wulfric. "Will the gods be angry?" she asked quietly. He hesitated, searching for words that could bridge the chasm between their worlds. "Sometimes," he said finally, "the gods are not angry with those who show mercy." Her small face softened, a tentative smile breaking through the shadows of fear. Then maybe they will see what you did as a gift. Wulfric nodded, the weight of her faith settling gently on his heart. Outside, the frost began to melt, tiny droplets forming on the branches like tears of hope. In the fragile light of morning, the impossible seemed just within reach, an end to the drought, a reprieve from sacrifice, a future where courage and compassion might carve a new path for Ravnholm. For now, in the quiet heart of the forest, the slave and the child shared a moment of peace. Two souls bound not by chains or blood, but by a fragile thread of trust woven in the darkness between shadows and firelight. The cold morning fog clung to the trees like a shroud, softening the edges of the forest and muffling distant sounds. Ravnholm's camp stirred uneasily beneath the heavy sky, the drought-stricken earth seeming to absorb the tension that thickened the air. Word had begun to spread beyond the camp's boundaries. The story of a Saxon slave who dared risk everything to save the Jarl's daughter from death's jaws. Whispers traveled like wildfire, carried by traders, hunters, and neighbors who lingered too long at the edges of the village. Soon, faces unfamiliar to Ravnholm appeared on the beaten paths, rough men clad in furs, eyes sharp with suspicion, and lips tight as they exchanged hushed words. News of Wulfric's act of defiance and the Jarl's mercy shook the fragile balance between clans and neighbors alike. At the heart of the camp, Wulfric sat by the fire in the small cabin where he had been confined since the incident. His shoulder throbbed beneath the coarse linen, still tender from the wolf's bite and Halfdan's careful ministrations. The cabin's walls felt like a prison now, the warmth of the hearth barely keeping the creeping chill at bay. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, carrying the distant echoes of voices and the clatter of hooves on frozen ground. He stared into the flickering flames, the dance of light and shadow mirroring the turmoil within. Freedom was granted, but that freedom carried a weight heavier than chains, the burden of suspicion and the looming threat of retribution from more than just his own captors. His mind raced through possibilities, each darker than the last. The Saxons who still clung to their land might see him as a traitor, a turncoat who had chosen the enemy's side. The Vikings, proud and volatile, could never fully forgive the breach of tradition, no matter the Jarl's decree. Freydis' visits were a bittersweet light in the growing darkness. The child's small hands brought gifts and whispered hopes, but even her innocence could not shield Wulfric from the gathering storm. She spoke of the village's unease, of neighbors questioning the Jarl's decision, and the murmurs of unrest among the warriors who bristled at the idea of sparing a slave. That evening, as the cold deepened and shadows lengthened, Wulfric heard the low murmur of voices beyond the cabin's thin walls. The Jarl's longhouse brimmed with restless men, their words sharp as axes striking stone. "They say the Saxon walks free now," one voice spat, thick with disdain. "Is this the honor of Ravnholm? To let a stranger live when the gods demand blood? Ragnar's will is law." Another answered, though his tone was uneasy. "Still, the gods' hunger is not sated by words or mercy." Outside, the wind whispered warnings. Wulfric's gaze drifted to the small window, the frost glinting like broken glass. His thoughts turned to the forest's edge, the wilds beyond the camp where danger waited in silence. He knew that news of his survival could stir more than just whispers. Other clans, rivals eager to exploit weakness, might see this as a chance to strike. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. One morning, as the pale sunlight barely pierced the heavy sky, the camp gates creaked open to reveal a delegation from the neighboring clan of Skjoldheim. Rugged men, their faces etched with the scars of many winters, stepped forward. Their leader, a stern-eyed warrior named Eirik, bore the weight of his tribe's grudges in every line of his face. Ragnar met them with stoic resolve, though the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes betrayed the conflict beneath. The visitors wasted no time. Eirik's voice, rough as the stones beneath their feet, cut through the cold air. "We heard of the Saxon spared," he said bluntly. As the moon rose high, its pale light spilling over the frozen earth, Wulfric resolved to face whatever storm was coming. He was no longer a nameless slave bound by chains and fear. He was a man who had chosen to stand between life and death, between the old ways and something new. But the world beyond Ravnholm's fires was watching, and the reckoning was yet to come. The following dawn broke heavy with frost and foreboding. The camp's usual bustle was subdued, the air charged with anticipation. Wulfric rose slowly, muscles stiff from broken rest, and prepared himself for what the day might bring. Outside, the sentries kept watchful eyes on the forest's edge. The low murmur of voices drifted from the longhouse, where the Jarl convened with his council. The tension was a tangible weight pressing down on the settlement, an unspoken threat lurking beneath every glance. Wulfric's isolation grew. The kindness that Freydis showed came at the risk of punishment. She visited less frequently, her small visits shadowed by vigilant eyes. Each encounter was a fragile moment stolen from a world that seemed determined to crush any spark of mercy. Then came the arrival of the scouts, men sent beyond the borders to gather news and watch for threats. Their faces were grim as they brought word that chilled the camp's fragile hopes. "The clans to the south prepare for war," one reported, voice low and urgent. "They see weakness in Ravnholm's mercy." The council's murmurs grew into heated debate. The priests spoke of omens, of balance upset, and debts unpaid. Warriors gripped their weapons with white-knuckled fury, their voices thick with anger and fear. Ragnar stood at the center, Jarl and judge, burdened by the weight of leadership. His gaze often flicked to the cabin where Wulfric waited, a man no longer just a slave, but a symbol of defiance that threatened to unravel the old order. That evening, as shadows deepened and the cold pressed in, Wulfric heard footsteps approaching. The door creaked open, revealing Astrid, her face set with a grim determination. "We must talk," she said quietly. Inside, away from prying ears, the shield maiden spoke of the growing danger. "The clans will not accept this," she warned. "Your life is a spark that could ignite a fire." Wulfric met her gaze, the pain and resolve etched deep in her features. "Then we must decide what kind of fire it will be." The night stretched long and cold, the fate of Ravnholm hanging in the balance. Outside, the wind carried the distant howl of wolves, a reminder that survival here was a battle fought not only with steel, but with courage and heart. In the gathering storm, a slave and a child had sparked a challenge to an ancient world, and no one knew how the tale would end. The morning air was sharp and biting, a cruel reminder that winter still gripped Ravnholm in its relentless hold. A thin veil of frost glazed the camp, glittering cold beneath a pale, overcast sky. The usual rhythms of the village felt fractured, as if everyone were holding their breath, waiting for an inevitable storm to break. The whispers had grown louder during the night. Rumors of war, of gods angered, of old debts that demanded blood. And at the heart of it all stood Wulfric, a man caught between worlds, his fate now a fulcrum upon which the future of the clan balanced. The longhouse was filled with restless bodies. Warriors clad in furs and leather leaned heavily against the wooden pillars, their faces hard and drawn. The men's voices were low but tense, threaded with anger and fear. The air carried the heavy scent of sweat, smoke, and ale, mingling with the metallic tang of sharpened blades resting on rough wooden tables. At the center of this brewing storm stood Jarl Ragnar Haraldsson, his towering frame rigid with authority. His piercing blue eyes scanned the faces before him, weighing every word, every glance. The council had convened early, summoned urgently after the arrival of the Skjoldheim delegation. The confrontation between the clans had shattered the fragile calm, threatening to ignite the tinderbox the Jarl had worked so hard to contain. Now, All eyes turned to the man whose very existence challenged the traditions of Ravenholm, Wulfric, the Saxon slave turned savior. Outside, the camp was uncharacteristically quiet. The usual clamor of smiths hammering, children playing, and hunters preparing for the day was subdued, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Sentinels paced the perimeter with grim determination, their hands never far from their weapons. The weight of uncertainty pressed down like a stone, settling deep into the bones of every man and woman. Inside the small cabin where Wulfric had been confined, the warmth of the hearth was a fragile comfort. His shoulder throbbed painfully beneath the bandages, but the physical pain was now overshadowed by the storm gathering outside. The door creaked open, and Freydis slipped inside, her eyes bright, yet heavy with worry. "Wulfric," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "They are angry. The others, they don't understand." He looked up, meeting her gaze, a mixture of fear, hope, and something stubbornly fierce. "I know," he replied, his voice rough but steady. "But you have given me strength. I will face what comes." The girl nodded, clutching her amulet tightly, as if drawing courage from the silver emblem of Freya. "I will stand with you," she promised. Outside, the murmur of voices rose in volume, spilling from the longhouse into the cold air. Warriors stepped forward, their faces grim, some openly hostile. Thorbjorn, the aged priest of Odin, moved among them, his presence like a shadow darkening the room. His one remaining eye gleamed with zealotry, his voice carrying the weight of ancient rites and uncompromising belief. "The gods demand balance," Thorbjorn intoned, his tone grave and unyielding. "Wulfric's interference has upset the sacred threads woven by the Nornas. Blood must be paid. The drought will not end without sacrifice." A murmur of assent rippled through the assembly. Many warriors bared their teeth in grim agreement, their loyalty to tradition unshaken. The old fears, the power of the gods, the necessity of blood, were carved deep into the marrow of their souls. Ragnar's gaze flicked to Wulfric, who stood silently nearby, his posture weary but unbroken. The Jarl's voice cut through the tension, steady and commanding, yet edged with uncertainty. "Wulfric saved my daughter's life," he declared. "He acted with courage, not malice. The gods sent him as a sign, perhaps a sign of mercy, not wrath." An eruption of voices followed, some shouting in support, others cursing the Saxon as a blasphemer, an enemy who dared defy the will of the gods. The clash of opinions threatened to tear the council apart. Astrid, the shield maiden, stepped forward, her eyes sharp and unwavering. "The child's life was spared," she said firmly. "That alone speaks of honor. But this decision is a knife's edge. We must not allow fear to blind us." Thorbjorn's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Honor," he spat. "A Saxon's life is worth less than the shadow of a blade. To spare him is to invite the gods' fury. Our ancestors demand respect. Sacrifice is not a choice. It is law." Ragnar's jaw clenched. The weight of leadership bore down on him like a crushing tide. His eyes met Freydis's, who stood silently at his side, a small figure of innocence and defiance. "Freydis," he said quietly, "what say you?" The girl stepped forward, her small frame trembling, but her voice clear and steady. "He saved me," she said, "and I owe him my life. The gods gave him to us to protect, not to die. A blood debt can be paid by life, not death." The hall fell into a stunned silence. The raw courage of the child cut through the tension like a blade. Men averted their gazes. Some struggled with the conflict between tradition and a simple truth that resonated deeper than fear. Thorbjorn's face darkened, but before he could respond, Ragnar raised his hand, silencing the room. "The gods have many faces," he said slowly. "Perhaps today they were the face of this Saxon." The Jarl's decision was not made lightly. The path he chose risked everything: the loyalty of his warriors, the favor of the gods, the stability of his clan. But in that moment, leadership demanded vision beyond fear. "Wulfric," Ragnar said, voice. The fire flickered low in the great hall, its warm glow casting long shadows that danced like restless spirits across the timber walls. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to drift silently, blanketing the earth in a fragile white. Inside, the air was thick with a fragile peace, a calm born not of certainty, but of uneasy surrender and the slow unraveling of fear. Wulfric sat near the hearth, his hands wrapped around a rough cup of warm mead, the heat seeping into his chilled fingers. The ache in his shoulder had faded to a dull throb, but the weight in his chest pressed as heavy as ever. Around him, the murmurs of the clans softened to a quiet hum, the tension that had gripped Ravenholm slowly releasing its hold. The Jarl's decision had sent ripples through the camp, waves of disbelief and grudging acceptance spreading like the thaw in the frozen earth. Freydis sat close by, her small hand resting lightly on Wulfric's arm, a silent tether between two worlds, one born of blood and tradition, the other of chains and exile. Her blue eyes shone with a mixture of pride and relief, the fierce determination that had pierced the gloom now softened by the quiet warmth of gratitude. The long hours of the day had been filled with cautious conversations and glances exchanged behind closed doors. Warriors who had once glared with suspicion now offered nods of acknowledgement, their respect earned not by birthright or bloodline, but by a single act of courage that had defied the ancient order. Ragnar Haraldsson, the Jarl whose word had shaped the fate of many, moved among his people with a gravity that spoke of the burdens he bore. His usually stern features were shadowed by the weight of leadership, a man who had chosen a path fraught with uncertainty for the sake of something greater than tradition. Later that evening, as the hall emptied and the fires burned low, Wulfric found himself standing outside beneath the vast expanse of the night sky. The stars glimmered cold and distant, like shards of ice scattered across the heavens. He breathed deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and snow. The silence around him was a balm and a burden. Freedom was his, yet the path ahead remained uncharted and perilous. His past was a shadow he could not outrun, and the fragile bonds he had forged were new and tentative. Still, beneath the weight of uncertainty, a quiet flame of hope flickered. A soft rustle behind him drew his attention. Freydis emerged from the shadows, her pale hair a ghostly halo in the moonlight. She stepped close, her small figure silhouetted against the snow-laden trees. "Will they forgive me?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Wulfric looked down at her, the lines of worry etched on her young face cutting deep. "It is not for us to say," he replied gently, "but what you did changed the course of many lives. That is no small thing." Her lips pressed into a determined line. "My father listens to me, even if others do not. Maybe someday they will too." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle between them. "Then we will carry that hope with us." The days that followed were a slow unraveling of old fears and grudges. The warriors who had once murmured threats now shared quiet words of respect. Astrid, the shield maiden whose arrows had once aimed for his death, met his gaze with a guarded nod, the sharp edge of her suspicion tempered by the undeniable truth of his bravery. Halfdan, the healer whose hands had tended both wounds and souls, offered quiet counsel. "Strength is not only in the sword," the old man had said one morning, his voice worn but wise. "Sometimes it is in mercy and in the courage to choose it." Wulfric found himself included in the rhythms of the camp in small but meaningful ways. He helped prepare tools alongside the other men, his hands steady and sure. He was allowed to sit by the fire during communal meals, the warmth no longer a privilege denied. And though the path to acceptance remained long, the walls around his heart began to soften. Freydis was a constant presence, a beacon of innocence and fierce loyalty. She shared stories of the gods and heroes, her voice bright with wonder as she spoke of Freya's blessings and Odin's wisdom. In those moments, Wulfric glimpsed a world beyond the harshness of captivity and conflict, a world where unity might one day grow from the seeds of compassion. Yet the shadows of doubt lingered. Thorbjorn, the priest whose zeal had once condemned him, remained a silent figure on the outskirts of the clan's life. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, watched from beneath heavy brows, a constant reminder that the gods' demand for balance was never fully at rest. One evening, as the camp settled under a starless sky, Wulfric found himself alone with the priest near the edge of the forest. The cold was biting, the air thick with the scent of pine and earth. Thorbjorn's voice was low but firm. "You have not escaped the gods' reckoning, Saxon," he said, his one eye gleaming. "The threads they weave are not so easily broken." Wulfric met his gaze steadily, the years of hardship hardening his resolve. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but the gods also watch those who show mercy. And sometimes, even they must learn." Thorbjorn's lips curled into a bitter smile before he turned away, the shadows swallowing his tall frame. The words hung between them like a challenge and a promise. In the days that followed, the camp was touched by the first true thaw of the season. The frozen earth softened beneath the warming sun, and the streams began to run once more with clear, rushing water. The drought that had hung like a curse over Ravnholm slowly lifted, as if the gods themselves had accepted the new offering. At the heart of this fragile renewal stood the bond between Wulfric and Freydis, a testament to the power of compassion to bridge divides that seemed as old as the land itself. On a crisp morning, the Jarl summoned the clan to the great hall. His voice carried the weight of finality and hope as he addressed them. "Today marks a turning," he declared. "The gods have shown us that strength lies not only in blood and battle, but in the courage to choose mercy. Wulfric stands among us not as slave, but as kin, one who has honored our blood and saved our child. Let this be a lesson and a beginning." A murmur of assent rippled through the crowd. Eyes that once narrowed in suspicion now gleamed with respect. The old lines, drawn deep by fear and tradition, began to blur beneath the weight of shared humanity. As the gathering dispersed, Wulfric stood beside Freydis, the warmth of the hall mingling with the light in her eyes. The road ahead was uncertain, the balance fragile, but in this moment, there was peace, a fragile, hard-won peace. The night settled softly over Ravnholm, the stars watching silently as firelight flickered through the windows. The winds carried the scent of pine and promise, the echoes of a story that would be told for many winters to come. A story of a slave who chose courage over fear, a child who embraced mercy over tradition, and a clan that learned the true meaning of sacrifice. In the cold north, where the shadows run long and the gods watch from afar, a new dawn had broken, quiet, uncertain, but filled with the fragile light of hope. The first light of dawn spilled softly over the thawing earth, casting a pale gold glow on the village of Ravnholm. The snow that had blanketed the land for weeks now melted into the soil, seeping into the parched ground beneath, whispering life back into the roots and streams. The air held the crisp, clear scent of pine and fresh water, a subtle promise that the harsh grip of winter was loosening at last. In the quiet streets, the villagers moved with tentative ease, warriors, women, children, all marked by the weight of recent hardships, yet carrying within them something lighter, a fragile hope. Wulfric stood near the edge of the longhouse, his gaze sweeping over the settlement he now called home. The coarse linen of his tunic clung to his frame beneath the soft sunlight, the bandages on his shoulder long removed, leaving only a faint scar like a silent testament to the night that had changed everything. His dark eyes, once clouded by chains and fear, now held a steady calm, shaped by the trials he had endured and the unexpected grace he had found. Around him, the village was stirring to a new rhythm. The goats nibbled at fresh shoots. The children's laughter echoed once more through the wooden huts, and Wulfric's gaze drifted toward the longhouse, where the Jarl and his council gathered in quiet conversation. "They will," he said slowly. "But forgiveness is a seed that takes time to grow." Freydis reached out, her small hand finding his rough palm. The contrast was stark, the softness of youth against the hardened life of a man once bound by chains. Yet in that touch lay a bond stronger than blood or law, a promise born of compassion, courage, and a shared journey through darkness. Nearby, Astrid stood watching them. The shield maiden's eyes, once sharp with suspicion, now held respect tempered with cautious acceptance. Her stance was relaxed, the bow at her side unused but ready, a symbol of vigilance balanced with newfound trust. She approached, her voice low but steady. "The clan is changing," she said, nodding toward the village. "Old ways will not die easily, but your courage has carved a path. The future will be harder for those who resist." Wulfric met her gaze, gratitude flickering beneath his calm exterior. "Then we will face it together." The words hung between them, unspoken yet understood, a silent pact forged not in blood, but in the shared will to build something new from the ashes of old fear. The seasons would turn, and with them, so too would the hearts of Ravnholm. Inside the longhouse, the Jarl Ragnar Haraldsson sat beside his wife, the weight of leadership momentarily lifted by the quiet joy of watching his daughter play with other children. The tension that had gripped the clan was easing, replaced by a cautious hope that the gods' favor might be regained not through sacrifice, but through unity and mercy. His hands rested on Freydis's small shoulders, the same hands that had once raised the sacred axe now laid to rest. He caught Wulfric's eyes across the room and gave a slow, solemn nod, a gesture heavy with meaning and respect. The Saxon had become more than a slave, more than a symbol. He was now a son of Ravnholm, a living reminder that honor could take many forms. Outside, the Curanduro Halfdan moved steadily among the villagers, his hands steady and sure as he tended to wounds small and great alike. His voice, gentle and patient, carried stories of healing, not just of flesh, but of spirit. The old man's eyes crinkled with a rare smile as he glanced toward Wulfric, now welcomed among the men who toiled under his care. There were still scars to mend beyond those visible on skin. The wounds left by years of conflict, fear, and captivity were deeper, etched in memory and whispered in quiet corners. But the very act of survival had begun a slow, fragile healing. To the south, the forest stretched thick and wild, a reminder of the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of the village. But for the first time in many moons, the wolves kept their distance, not out of fear, but because the balance of the land had shifted. The hunters told stories of the pack moving further into the mountains, driven away not by arrows alone, but by a changing tide of fate. One morning, Wulfric stood at the edge of the forest, the cool breath of the woods carrying the scent of pine and earth. He clutched a small carved figure in his palm, a gift from Freydis, a token of Freya's blessing and protection. His eyes traced its worn edges, the simple craftsmanship speaking of hope and new beginnings. Beside him, Freydis watched the rising sun cast shafts of light through the thinning mist. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. He looked down at her, seeing the young woman she would become reflected in those bright eyes. "For now," he replied. "This is my place, with you and the clan." The girl's smile was soft but resolute. "Then we will walk this path together." As the seasons turned, the village of Ravnholm embraced a new rhythm, one shaped by the lessons of courage and mercy, the quiet strength found in unexpected alliances. The old rites of sacrifice gave way to ceremonies of gratitude and remembrance, honoring the gods not with blood alone, but with offerings of life, community, and honor. The old priest Thorbjorn remained a figure of stern tradition, his voice still echoing in the longhouse. But even he softened, his zeal tempered by the undeniable changes in the clan's heart. He watched from the shadows, a guardian of the past learning to coexist with the future. And in time, the story of the Saxon slave who had saved the Jarl's daughter became legend, a tale told by firesides and woven into the sagas of the North. It was a story not just of survival, but of transformation, of how the smallest voice, the bravest heart, could alter the course of many. Wulfric's name was spoken with respect, no longer as a curse or threat, but as a symbol of hope. Freydis grew strong and wise, her courage a beacon for new generations who would know that honor need not be bound by blood, and that mercy could be the greatest sacrifice of all. One crisp evening, long after the snows had melted and the earth had awakened beneath a warm sun, Wulfric stood at the edge of the village once more. His heart was heavy with memories of all he had lost, the home he could never return to, the family left behind in distant lands. Yet here, among these people who had once seen him as nothing more than a slave, he had found something new. He turned to Freydis, standing beside him like a pillar of light. "There is a world beyond these forests," he said softly. "One I may need to seek one day." Her grip tightened on his arm, steadying and sure. "Wherever you go, you will carry Ravenholm with you." He smiled, the weight in his chest lifting just a little. "And I will carry you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of blood and gold, the village of Ravenholm settled into the quiet promise of night. The fires burned low, the stars blinked cold but steady overhead, and the world held its breath, ready to witness the dawn of a new age. In this land of ice and shadow, where legends are carved with steel and sacrifice, a single act of compassion had sown the seeds of change. And from that, a fragile peace was born, a legacy of honor, courage, and the enduring power of mercy. The fire's glow had long since faded, leaving the great hall quiet and dim beneath the vast, unyielding sky of the north. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches outside, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and the distant promise of renewal. Wulfric stood alone at the edge of the village, the rough earth beneath his feet softening with the slow thaw of winter's grip. His breath formed pale clouds in the cold morning air, thoughts moving slowly, as if weighed down by all that had passed. He looked out over the land, the frozen fields now beginning to darken with the first hints of life returning beneath the melting snow. The trees leaned solemnly against the horizon, their bare limbs stretching toward a sky that was slowly letting go of its heavy gray shroud. The silence was broken only by the distant calls of ravens, their caws sharp against the stillness. In this quiet moment, Wulfric's mind wandered back through the winding paths of memory, the shadowed days of chains and servitude, the sharp bite of the wolf's jaws, the desperate leap that had saved a child's life. He remembered the cold eyes of the Jarl, the whispered prayers of the priest, and above all, the fierce, unwavering gaze of Freydis. A child's courage had stood between death and mercy, shaking the foundations of a world built on blood and tradition. He touched the small wooden carving in his hand, the rough edges worn smooth by countless fingers. A gift from the girl who had believed in him when none else did. A token of Freya's blessing, a quiet symbol of hope in a land where hope was often as fragile as the thin ice beneath their feet. Freedom had come like a slow dawn, uncertain and uneven. The chains that bound his body were broken, but the weight of suspicion still pressed heavily against his spirit. He was no longer a slave, yet the road to belonging was long and uncertain. The grudges of men and gods alike lingered like shadows, and the scars of the past were etched deep, both in flesh and in memory. Yet the thaw had begun, not just in the earth, but in the hearts of those around him. The warriors who once glared with contempt now nodded with grudging respect. The women whispered stories of mercy and change. Even the priest, that stern guardian of ancient rites, had begun to soften, understanding that the tide of fate was turning in ways the old songs had not. Behind them, the village stirred awake. The smell of wood smoke and fresh bread drifted through the crisp air. Children's laughter echoed faintly, mingling with the soft murmur of life returning to the land. The longhouse stood tall and steady, its timbers a testament to endurance through storm and strife. Far from the world he once knew, Wulfric had found something precious, a place not just of shelter, but of belonging. The chains might be gone, but the journey to freedom was only just beginning. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the fields, the rain began to fall softly, a gentle, steady blessing from the gods above. Each drop carried the promise of renewal, washing away the dust of old fears and planting the seeds of hope deep in the earth. In that moment, beneath the endless sky, Wulfric understood that true sacrifice was never about the spilling of blood alone. It was in the courage to choose life over death, mercy over fear, and compassion over tradition. And sometimes, the smallest voices, the fragile ones, could change the fate of many. If this story of courage and compassion touched your heart, join us and be part of a journey that honors the true spirit of the North. Subscribe to walk with us through the shadows and the firelight, where the past and the future are forever entwined. For in this land of ice and honor, it was learned that compassion could be the mightiest weapon of all.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.